So good evening everyone. My name is Maurya Hanspal and in today's session we're gonna continue our previous session on ways to invest in stock market. So today we have the ways to invest in stock market session number 2. In the previous class yesterday in the YT session at 7:30 p.m. we tried to understand the various instruments to invest in stock markets or various instruments to invest in market. And we try to understand the difference between a market and a stock market because market is different from stock market. So that was our first session on ways to invest in stock market, session number 1. In today's session we're going to continue our discussion again on various kinds of instruments you people can use to invest in stock markets or further enhancement on those instruments that we discussed earlier. In the previous session yesterday, we talked about the equity instruments and debt instruments. Equity instruments, as I discussed about, it is high risk, higher expected return. High risk, higher expected return. So that is one thing you people need to understand. And equity, it depends on the risk appetite of a person. How much risk a person can take in equities. Okay, so that is one thing which you people need to understand about equities. And risk appetite is not based on the age of that person. A lot of people think that the risk appetite is based on the age of that person. If a person is older, then his risk appetite would be low. That's what a large number of people believe. Okay, but this is not the fact. It also depends on the personal circumstances, the amount of finances that you have, and how much risk can you take. But more or less, equity is high risk. It is for those people who are aggressive in the market. And we tried to discuss that yesterday. Then we also talked about the bond market. You know, guys, the bond market is bigger than the equity market. But just 1 or 2% of the bonds are traded in the share market. I would repeat the same point. Just 1 or 2% of the bonds are traded in the share market, being the bonds market larger than the share market. So where are these bonds traded? That I will tell you. Then we also try to discuss that the people who are risk averse, those people prefer bonds over equity, who want to preserve their capital. Again, not on age. It's a great myth about age. Okay. So there is a website, as we all call it. Yeah. So there is a website by the name of Golden Pie. I'm not promoting this website, nor it's a sponsored promotion. Okay. There is a website called Golden Pie. On this website of Golden Pie, you can trade bonds with a minimum investment of 10,000 rupees. And that is somewhat the drawback of bonds also. You cannot buy bonds with a very small amount कि 500 रुपए के जैसे तुम शेयर्स खरीद लेते हो या 200 rupees के शेयर्स खरीद लेते हो. You cannot buy bonds with a very low amount. The minimum amount by which you can buy bonds is 10,000 rupees. So 10,000 rupees you must have in your pocket in order to invest in bonds. And then we also try to understand the high risk bonds, which are the C category or the D category bonds, the speculative bonds or the junk bonds. Since we are taking more amount of risk in those bonds, so there would be higher expected return. Also, we talked about the investment grade bonds, which are the AAA bonds. Those were the low risk, but a lower risk and a lower return. Because अगर आप मतलब कि the amount of risk which you are taking is low, then the amount of return would also be low. That were the AAA bonds, which would not default ideally. And then we also try to understand कि Franklin Templeton scheme में क्या हुआ था when they closed the 6 debt schemes. Also, we try to understand the segregated portfolio as well. So let's continue with our discussion on bonds. अब हम bonds की बात कर ही रहे थे. One thing that you need to understand about bonds. Again, agreed. These are for the people who are risk averse, who do not want to take much more risk in the market. And those people are more or less concerned about their capital preservation. कि जितना पैसा कमाया है, they want to save that. And they want to have some fixed but incremental return on that. Okay, so that are bonds. We also try to talk about fixed deposits. Fixed deposits, though rarely they beat inflation, or with a marginal amount, those fixed deposits are beating the context of inflation. But FDs should not be considered from the point of view of returns. There would be a large amount of people in market and on various channels. They would advise you that do not invest in fixed deposits or FDs because they rarely beat inflation. Okay, invest in fixed deposits also, but do not expect a higher amount of return, or do not invest in fixed deposits for a higher return. Invest in fixed deposits just for an emergency fund or a contingency fund, that your amount is saved in that, which I believe. For returns, invest in equity or somewhere bonds. But do invest in fixed deposits in case your money erodes in equities, or in case you had been investing in C class bonds or D class bonds, which are the speculative bonds or the junk bonds, and your wealth gets eroded. Still, you'll have a backup as a contingency fund or an emergency fund as fixed deposits. But bonds have an advantage over the concept of fixed deposits. Why? Because bonds are offering you a higher rate of return as compared to the fixed deposits. So that is the greatest advantage on bonds. And fixed deposits may again, like you might be wondering, fixed deposits may like there can be a kind of default from the bank as well, as happened in case of like various other banks. To protect the investors from all such defaults, like if the bank goes into bankruptcy, because we had have the cases in the past that big banks, be it your like Yes Bank and various other private banks, have gone into the context of like bankruptcy or even into closure. But how their fixed deposits were saved? The SEBI and the various government agencies and the finance department, they came with an act or the fixed deposit insurance. That is, if you have invested certain money in fixed deposits, your main amount, that is the principal amount, as well as your interest amount that you would earn on FD, is secured to the extent of 5 lakh rupees. चाहे बैंक बंद होता है, बैंक goes into losses or bank goes into bankruptcy, where 5 lakh amount is preserved and that is the maximum extent. अब किसी का 2 लाख का लॉस होगा तो उसको बस 2 लाख ही मिलेगा, तो उसको 5 लाख नहीं मिलेंगे. So up to 5 lakhs, it is secured. Okay, so that is the one benefit of FDs as well. तो अब हम वापस आते हैं bonds में. So when you are investing in bonds, you can invest in two types of bonds. One you would have as the short-term bonds, and the other you can have as the long-term bonds. Again, it depends upon your understanding of the market or the changes in the market dynamics, that in which kind of bonds you want to invest. Let's take a simple example. In market, the yield that you earn on bonds, yield is nothing but the final amount or interest that you are getting on your bonds. अगर bonds में like 1 लाख invest करा है, तो 1 लाख तो मिलेगा वापस at maturity. But उसके अलावा the final interest payment that you get on bonds, because bonds are also paying you an yearly coupon payment, right? So face value, so अगर if you have purchased a 1 lakh bond today, and that bond has a maturity period of 5 years from now, that 1 lakh you're gonna get anyhow after 5 years. Okay. But apart from that, there would be some coupon payment as well, some interest payment as well yearly. So when we calculate all these, the final amount that you get from bonds is the yield that you are getting. Okay. And we have an yield curve. This yield curve is plotted like this, a rising yield curve that you can see. A rising yield curve, it basically shows you that the yields or the final amount or the final rate of interest that you are getting would be more for the longer term bonds. Only if this yield curve is rising. This yield curve is rising. Okay. This yield curve is nothing, the final amount that you are getting on that bonds. If this yield curve is rising, it shows the yields on longer term bonds would be more than the yields in shorter term bonds. मतलब लॉन्ग टर्म बॉन्ड्स में पैसा इंटरेस्ट तुमको ज्यादा मिलेगा एज कंपेयर टू शॉर्ट टर्म बॉन्ड्स. बट अगर यील्ड ज्यादा होगी तो द प्राइस ऑफ द बॉन्ड वुड कम डाउन, एंड दैट इज द इनवर्स रिलेशनशिप ऑफ बॉन्ड्स दैट वी स्टडीड यस्टरडे, राइट? If the yields are rising, the price would fall, and that is the inverse relationship between yield and price of the bond. Okay, तो yield जैसे जैसे बढ़ती रहेंगी तो bonds का प्राइस कम हो जाएगा, and अगर प्राइस कम हो गया, so then you're gonna have market to market losses, because there are two kinds of risk when you invest in bonds. Two kinds of risk. One is the price risk, and the second is the reinvestment risk. The second is first is the price risk, and the second is the reinvestment risk. ठीक है. अब your yield and price of the bond are inversely they are like related to each other. Okay. तो अगर yield बढ़ रही है, अगर रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट बॉन्ड से ज्यादा मिल रहा है तो प्राइस कम हो जाएगा. तो yield तो मिल रही है, वी आर गेटिंग अ हायर रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट तो मिल रहा है. तो अ री इन्वेस्टमेंट रिस्क इज समवेयर काइंड ऑफ रिड्यूस्ड, बिकॉज अगर हमारा लॉन्ग टर्म बॉन्ड से हमको ज्यादा पैसा मिल रहा है, we can again reinvest that amount in a higher yield bond, right? But still, like we're gonna have losses in our portfolio on the basis of the total value of the portfolio and not on the basis of interest or yield. On the basis of your income, on the basis of your yield or interest, you are getting a higher amount. But on the basis of your total portfolio value, अगर बॉन्ड आपने लाइक 100 रुपए का खरीदा होगा एंड अगर मतलब कि रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट बढ़ गया तो उसकी वैल्यू 100 से 90 रुपीज हो जाएगी. तो मार्केट टू मार्केट लॉसेस विल कम इन पोर्टफोलियो अपार्ट फ्रॉम द यील्ड व्हिच इज मोर एग्रीड. ओके, सो इफ यू थिंक दैट द longer term bonds will give you more interest in future, or the yields on longer term bonds, which is shown as a positive indicator through a rising yield curve. Okay, मतलब कि ज्यादा इंटरेस्ट मिलने का चांस है. तो what do people do? They start to buy the bonds right now. If they're having an expectation that the yield on bonds would increase, they would start to buying the bonds right now. ठीक है, अब bonds खरीदना वो start करेंगे. अब when they're purchasing the bonds, that money would be taken out from the equity share markets, right? Because obviously, if you are investing in one thing, you would always have to take out money from your other investments, or somewhat you'll have to rebalance your portfolio, right? So in order to invest in bonds, the person would be taking out money from the equity markets. And that is why when the rate of interest rises in the market, as it is happening in nowadays as well, that the banks are taking away their accommodative stance, that they are sucking off the liquidity from the market and they've started to increase the rate of interest indirectly. Okay. And even the Federal Reserve of USA has also said to increase the interest rate to 3 or 4 times in 2022. So people know that they would be getting a higher rate of interest from bonds and equity में इतना पैसा नहीं होगा. When bonds become quite attractive, the equity market starts to fall a bit. And there is an inverse relationship between the bond market and the equity market. अब bond से पैसा मिल रहा है ज्यादा, so people will start to withdraw their money from the equity market and put in the bond market because of higher yield. And because of that, there would be a certain correction in the market. The market won't crash. There would be a certain correction in the market because of higher yield. Okay. And that is why when people know कि future में अपना rate of interest बढ़ना है, as we know right now कि 2022 में the rate of interest would increase on bonds, the people have started to sell in the market for equity and started to buy the bonds because they have the hope that the long-term bonds will give them a higher rate of return. So that is a rising yield curve. अगर आपको लगता है कि long-term bonds आपको ज्यादा return दे रहे हैं, तो equity से अपने पैसे withdraw मत करो. और अगर तुम विड्रॉ कर रहे हो तो a certain amount, बहुत कम अमाउंट करो विड्रॉ, और try to take out money from your own bank balances or cash balances and start investing in bonds. Okay. But if you think that the yield curve, apart from rising, it is being flat or it is falling or being flat, it means shorter term bonds are giving you more yield as compared to longer term bonds. Shorter term bonds are giving you more yield as compared to longer term bonds. So what would people do? If shorter term bonds are giving them more yield, then people will start to purchase the short term bonds and sell the long term bonds. Because abhi rate of interest ज़्यादा मिल रहा है. Okay. So people will start purchase the short term bonds and start selling the long term bonds. जब फ्यूचर में रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट ज्यादा मिलेगा, then people will start to buy the long term bonds in anticipation of a higher good return in future and sell the short term bonds. So that is one thing you need to understand in case of bonds and look in the bond market. Okay, so that is one thing very necessary that you need to know. I'll just remove all this. One more thing also happens in market for which you people must be aware about in the bond market. Like for example, there are two companies, one is company A and one is company B. Okay, company A says that the face value of the bond is 100 rupees and I am offering 8% rate of return. Okay, 8% interest rate. Okay, so people will start to buy the bonds of this company. They would say कि 8% कम नहीं होता, and they will start to buy the bond of these companies. Okay, now what will happen if they're buying the bond of that company? Since there is more demand, the price of that commodity increases. In this case, bond is the security जिसका price बढ़ जाएगा. 100 रुपए की face value है and people are buying that bond in case of higher anticipation of interest rate. So since the demand of that bond has increased, they would not be purchasing that bond for 100 rupees. The value of that bond might go to 120 rupees or 130 rupees, like just for a simple example. Just because there is huge demand in the market and लोगों को लग रहा है 8% they are getting a higher rate of interest in the market. And when there is huge demand in the market, the price of bond rises, but the rate of interest remains same. तो 120 का बॉन्ड खरीद के इंटरेस्ट रेट 8% ही मिल रहा है, राइट? इंटरेस्ट रेट 100 पर ही मिल रहा है. नाउ यू आर पेइंग मोर. इज इट बेनिफिशियल फॉर यू? इट इज, बट नॉट दैट मच. सेम ही चीज अगर दूसरी कंपनी मार्केट में आती है, बोलती है कि 100 रुपए की फेस वैल्यू है एंड 12% का रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट वी आर गिविंग. नाउ पीपल विल स्टार्ट टू शिफ्ट देयर मनी हियर. पीपल विल स्टार्ट टू शिफ्ट देयर मनी हियर. बोलेंगे कि 12% का रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट हमको मिल रहा है एंड कंपनी बी इज गिविंग अस अ हायर रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट देन कंपनी ए, बिकॉज कंपनी ए तो बस 8% दे रही थी, कंपनी बी दे रही है 12%. अब इस बॉन्ड की डिमांड बढ़ जाएगी. द डिमांड फॉर बॉन्ड बी विल राइज एंड वैल्यू ऑफ 100 विल गो ऑन टू 120. नाउ दे आर गेटिंग पेइंग 120 रुपीज, इंटरेस्ट 12% ही मिल रहा है, इंटरेस्ट नहीं बढ़ा बिकॉज ऑफ द इनवर्स रिलेशनशिप. बट सिंस इस बॉन्ड की सप्लाई मार्केट में बढ़ गई, बिकॉज पीपल आर सेलिंग द बॉन्ड ए, बिकॉज दे आर गेटिंग लेस अमाउंट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट रेट इन बॉन्ड ए एज कंपेयर टू बॉन्ड बी. एंड जिस चीज की मार्केट में सेलिंग ज्यादा होती है, सेल ज्यादा होती है, उसका प्राइस गिर जाता है. 100 का बॉन्ड 80 पे आ जाएगा अप्रॉक्स. पीपल वुड बी परचेजिंग द बॉन्ड फॉर 80 रुपीज एंड गेटिंग 8% रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट. यहाँ पे दे वुड बी परचेजिंग द बॉन्ड मतलब कि महंगे में 120, 130, 140 में, बट रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट 12% ही मिलेगा. नाउ विच इज द बेटर चॉइस? अगेन बॉन्ड ए इज अ बेटर चॉइस, बिकॉज कम पैसे देके भी तुमको उतना ही अमाउंट ऑफ रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट मिल रहा है. तो दीज थिंग्स पीपल अवॉइड इन मार्केट. जहां पर ज्यादा रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट मिल रहा है, दे स्टार्ट टू गो देयर. बट यहाँ पे उतनी कम इन्वेस्टमेंट से, अब तो और भी कम इन्वेस्टमेंट करनी पड़ेगी, उतना ही फिक्स रिटर्न मिल रहा है. और यहाँ पे ज्यादा इन्वेस्टमेंट करके सेम रिटर्न मिल रहा है. ठीक है, सो दीज थिंग्स यू नीड टू अंडरस्टैंड. ओके, अब apart from that, see, we talked about FDs, we talked about bonds, we talked about equities. Apart from that, मतलब कि बहुत सारी schemes होती हैं, ठीक है, like which are like implemented by government. You have the Public Provident Fund, you have the NPS, the National Pension Scheme, you have the Kisan Vikas Patra, the KVP, you have the Post Office Savings Scheme, PSS, Post Office Savings Scheme, you have the Senior Citizens Savings Scheme, the SSS. That is the Public Provident Fund, the National Pension Scheme, the Kisan Vikas Patra, the Post Office Savings Scheme, the Senior Citizen Savings Scheme. So all these instruments are meant for a fixed rate of return. And these instruments won't default at all. And why these instruments won't default at all? Because they are like guaranteed by the government of India. Though we do not have much time to talk about all these instruments like specifically, but in short, if I want to sum up about all these instruments are secured by the government of India, and these are also held by the various organizations, and various organizations have also made it mandatory to invest in PPF and NPS specifically. And they are getting a rate of interest from 7 to 8%, and the lock-in period goes on to 5 years. Okay, and 5 साल बाद आप अपना पैसा विड्रॉ कर सकते हो from PPF और NPS. And even you have a premature, like मतलब कि in NPS में क्या होता है, you have a ratio of 60 to 40%, like if you are like withdrawing it at the end. 60% यू गेट इन लमसम, अगर 100 रुपए इन्वेस्ट कर रहे हैं तो 60 रुपीज मिल जाएगा हाथ में, एंड 40 रुपीज वुड बी इन द फॉर्म ऑफ एनुइटी, मतलब कि मंथली इनकम मिलेगी एंड दैट वुड बी टैक्सेबल। ठीक है, बट अगर आप प्रीमेच्योर विड्रॉवल करते हो तो रेशियो लाइक 80 to 20% का रह जाता है। 20% आपको लमसम में मिलता है एंड 80% गेट्स इनटू एनुइटी विच इज टैक्सेबल। अब किसान विकास पत्र है, इवन यू हैव द सुकन्या समृद्धि योजना, सुकन्या समृद्धि योजना, so that is for the girl child, investing a minimum amount of 500 to 1000 rupees, and that you can withdraw that amount at the age of 18 years or 21 years, like whichever is earlier, like when your daughter marries or for some higher education. Even like kisan ka like this kisan vikas patra, even this your like post office saving schemes, you have the maximum limit of 4.5 lakhs for one account, and अगर दो लोग हैं तो 9 लाख की लिमिट हो जाती है, and that is the minimum amount that you can invest. The senior citizen savings scheme, which is basically for like 60 years plus for male and 55 years अगर like female की age है, but these age like they tend to differ like from year to year, and even the rate of interest also differs. So senior citizen savings scheme is basically for those people जिनकी minimum age 60 साल की होगी. So these are basically some fixed return plans which are guaranteed by the government of India and also mandated by most of the organizations nowadays as well. So these things also you should have an idea about. Plus you also have the treasury bonds, the T bonds, which are again secured by government. You have the T notes, you have the T bills. अब इसमें लोगों को बहुत मतलब कि confusion होता है. Though the purpose of all this is the same, these are like some security instruments which are issued by the government, which offer like a certain amount of fixed return, and there is no risk because the government is backing these securities. अब गवर्नमेंट बॉन्ड्स में क्या होगा कि 30 years की मेच्योरिटी होगी, and you will be getting the rate of interest semi annually, मतलब कि हर 6 महीने में like you will be getting a rate of interest, and that the amount of rate of interest will be fixed by the government. T notes are basically मतलब कि 10 साल तक के लिए होते हैं, from like 2 to 10 years के लिए like उनकी maturity होती है, and again you are getting half yearly rate of interest. T bills तुम्हारे like 91 days T bills होते हैं, you have 364 days T bills, you have like 180 days T bills, like 91 T bills, 182 days T bills, and 364 days T bills. These kinds of T bills are the most common one. Okay, तो इनके लाइक मेच्योरिटी मतलब कि 3 टाइप की होती है, एक तो 91 डेज की, एक 180 डेज की, एक 364 डेज की. तो दैट इज बेसिकली फॉर 1 year पीरियड. तो इसमें तुम्हारा जो भी बॉन्ड्स हो रहे हैं तो लाइक सेमी एनुअली तो रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट मिल रहा है एंड 30 years की मेच्योरिटी है. टी नोट्स में भी तुमको लाइक सेमी एनुअली जो रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट मिल रहा है, ठीक है, एंड 10 साल की मेच्योरिटी है. टी बिल्स आर अ काइंड ऑफ जीरो कूपन बॉन्ड्स. इसमें क्या होता है कि कोई रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट नहीं मिलता, बट दीज बॉन्ड्स आर इशूड एट अ डिस्काउंट. अगर 100 रुपए की फेस वैल्यू होगी, सो दीज बॉन्ड्स वुड बी लाइक इशूड एट 90 rupees, एंड 1 साल बाद तुमको अपने पास 100 रुपए मिल जाएंगे वापस, मतलब कि 10 रुपए का गेन होगा. ओके, सो टी बिल्स आर इशूड एट अ डिस्काउंट बिकॉज यहाँ पे मतलब कि रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट देने का कुछ फायदा नहीं है, बिकॉज बस 1 साल के लिए यू हैव बीन इन्वेस्टिंग. सो दीज बिल्स आर इशूड एट अ डिस्काउंट एंड रिडीम्ड एट पार. So that is in the case of T-bills. तो ये भी सब मतलब कि सिक्योरिटीज ही हैं for which you can invest in market. अब the most ठीक है, एक और इंस्ट्रूमेंट की बात कर लेते हैं. You have REITs. REITs, which are nothing but the real estate investment trust. अब इसमें those people who do not know REIT, first of all, like don't get confused and get panic, because a lot of people think to earn money from property or to earn money from a home is to buy that home and उसको फिर रेंट पे चढ़ा दो. ठीक है, तो you should have a home for that. But what happens in real estate investment trust? A trust is created by a company सो व्हाट डज द कंपनी डू? द कंपनी बोलती है लोगों को, दैट इज बेसिकली द रिटेल इन्वेस्टर्स, हाई नेटवर्थ पीपल, टू गिव मनी टू दैट ट्रस्ट. सो लोग अपने अपने लाइक कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशन देते हैं वहां पे. एंड द मिनिमम अमाउंट इज 10,000 rupees. Earlier, like it used to be in lakhs, but through a recent like notification by SEBI, this amount has been reduced to 10,000 rupees to make it affordable for people. तो मिनिमम लाइक 10,000 rupees लोग इसमें करते हैं इन्वेस्ट ट्रस्ट में. कोई 20,000, कोई 30,000, कोई 10 लाख, कोई 1 करोड़. तो अ पूल ऑफ मनी इज क्रिएटेड इन रीट्स. ठीक है, अ पूल ऑफ मनी इज क्रिएटेड. Then this money is invested into commercial properties, high generating solid properties, okay, जो इनकम देंगी ही देंगी. Okay, income generating assets. More than 80% of the amount is invested in income generating assets, be it your office space or residential space or commercial space, जहां से पैसा आना ही आना. और इससे जो भी पैसा बनता है, ठीक है, इससे जो भी पैसा बनता है, they give back to investors. And at least 90% they have to give as dividends. 90% उनको देना ही देना है as dividends. इससे कम वो दे नहीं सकते. एक हब बना दिया है कि जो लोग अपना घर खरीद के लाइक उसको रेंट पे नहीं दे सकते, सो अ पूल हैज बीन क्रिएटेड एंड उसमें लोग पैसे डालते हैं अपने, एंड उस पैसे को मार्केट में अच्छे अच्छे लाइक कमर्शियल प्रॉपर्टीज में डाल दिया जाता है. 80%, एटलीस्ट 80% इज इन हाई क्वालिफाइड इनकम जनरेटिंग एसेट्स, ताकि वहां पे कुछ लॉस ना हो एंड पैसा आए. 90% मिनिमम अमाउंट इन्वेस्टर्स को वापस देना ही देना है एज डिविडेंड. ओके, सेम कॉन्सेप्ट इसमें हमारा आता है. सी, इफ यू वांट टू इन्वेस्ट इन 1 stock, 2 stocks, 5 stocks, इट्स फाइन, बट इंस्टेड यू कैन क्रिएट अ पोर्टफोलियो ऑफ स्टॉक्स. दैट इज बेसिकली योर म्यूचुअल फंड्स. ओके, instead of investing in 1 stock, you can create a portfolio of stocks, and that portfolio of stock is nothing but the mutual funds. That is, instead of investing in only one security, that is, instead of investing in only the stocks of pharma sector or only the stocks of IT sector, you can combine stocks from various sectors and create a portfolio and term it as a mutual fund. So mutual fund mein either it helps you for the process of diversification and helps you to create a portfolio. Okay, so mutual fund में क्या होता है? Basically एक pool होता है. We're having a pool, and in that pool you are supplying money into that pool, and that pool is maintained by a bank. Okay, either you can invest all the amount at one time, which is nothing but the lump sum, or you can invest through the SIPs, which are the systematic investment plans. तुम SIPs के थ्रू इन्वेस्ट करो इन म्यूचुअल फंड्स. ओके, ट्राई टू इन्वेस्ट थ्रू SIPs इन म्यूचुअल फंड्स. मतलब एक लमसम अमाउंट मान लो कि 10,000 की इनिशियल इन्वेस्टमेंट करी, देन एवरी मंथ यू आर कंट्रीब्यूटिंग 5,000 rupees in that mutual fund. Okay, so mutual fund will help you to diversify your portfolio. मान लो if like during this COVID-19 pandemic, if anyone had invested only in the stocks of the hotel industry, then COVID-19 में his portfolio would have completely turned negative because he just invested in one industry. If that person would have created a portfolio of proper allocation of stocks and rebalancing of stocks, जिसमें होटल इंडस्ट्री के स्टॉक्स तो होते ही होते, प्लस फार्मा भी होता, IT भी होता, FMCG भी होता, सीमेंट इंडस्ट्रीज भी होती, एंड रियल एस्टेट भी होती. So his portfolio would have balanced out because pharma, IT, and FMCG they performed well in COVID-19, and even now the real estate is also performing well. So his portfolio would have balanced out. So instead of investing in just one stock or investing in stock of a particular sector and taking our portfolio towards a higher amount of risk, it is beneficial to create your own portfolio or invest in mutual funds. And mutual funds में जब invest करोगे, look at the expense ratio. Look at the expense ratio ज़्यादा ना हो. Expense ratio is basically जो भी like mutual funds के जो fund manager के charges होते हैं, कि stocks की मतलब अदला बदली करना, कि कौन सा stock like अच्छा perform करे उसको portfolio में डालना, जो stock अच्छा perform नहीं करा उसको portfolio से निकाल देना. Okay, plus their administrative charges, handling the portfolio, थोड़ा बहुत पेपर वर्क. तो लाइक ये चार्जेस कम से कम होने चाहिए. आइडियली मतलब कि 1 to 3% होता है, बट ट्राई करना कि 1% से ज्यादा ना हो. लाइक कीप द मैक्सिमम लिमिट एज 1%. तो अगर तुमको लाइक मतलब कि म्यूचुअल फंड से अगर लाइक मतलब कि 10% का रिटर्न मिल रहा है एंड 3% का तुम्हारा एक्सपेंस रेशियो ही हो गया, देन योर रिटर्न वुड कम आउट टू बी लाइक 7%। ठीक है, तो बेटर है कि इस एक्सपेंस रेशियो को कम से कम रखो, ताकि जो भी रेट ऑफ रिटर्न तुमको मिले वो ज्यादा से ज्यादा। ठीक है, सी in these sessions we talked about equities, bonds, mutual funds, and the real estate investment trusts. In the further sessions, like which would be a new series for new year in January, I would be talking about various kinds of instruments more, which you people can use to invest in stock markets. Again, in mutual funds की जब हम बात कर रहे हैं, you have the active style of investing, you have the passive style of investing, you have the equity mutual funds, debt funds, hybrid funds. So that is on the basis of the investment objective. You have on the basis of investment style, active or passive. You have on the basis of structure, open-ended, close-ended, or interval funds. You have ETFs, exchange-traded funds. You have the infrastructure and investment trust, as in case of REITs also. Okay. Also, you have, like when we talk about, you have like different kinds of debt instruments also. You have the perpetual debt. You have like different strategies of creating a bond laddering, immunization and dedication, bond swaps. So all kinds of things are present, like when you are dealing with instruments, and forwards and futures are also there, and commodity space is also there. Even like in commodities market, you have the agri commodities and non-agri commodities. In agri commodities, we have all that chana, dal, cotton, and all that stuff, moong, soya bean. Okay, in that non-agri commodities, you have the energy one, you have crude, natural gas, you have those metals, copper, iron, aluminium. In precious metals, you have gold, palladium, platinum, silver. So अभी सुनने में लग रहा होगा कि बहुत जल्दी बोल दिया, but all these things I'll try to cover in the new series of different ways to invest in stock markets from January onwards. Okay, but today is not over for today. We have one more session today. It starts at 6:45 p.m. That is basically the introduction to financial management. That what is financial management? Okay, so that we would be talking about today from 6:45 p.m. So up till then, all the best and see you at 6:45 p.m. today.